me start this off with the question of Lucy. Let's talk about best practices that you see in operations.
Thanks, Jim. Well, and thanks, Merrick. Great job on giving a very clear and concise background on what us as a bank have to deal with as a regulated bank. And it extends the entire customer cycle. So therefore, you know, all of our groups such as marketing, sales, operations, credit.
Lucy, can you hear me? We've lost your sound.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Now we have it back. So could you rewind a little bit?
Don't know where it stopped. I'll just restart with the importance of having the
We lost it again. Let's do. There we go.
We're just talking about technology, so.
Right. All right, you're
Okay,
back.
Well, I'll just quickly jump to what we ensure we do is that our employees and our processes and systems take it lightly. And we have many processes in place to mitigate the risk as best as possible. Some of them manual.
Lucy, we lost you again on the sound. Let's try this. Bruce, can we go to you and hear what your best practices are?
Yeah, let me try and fix mine.
Yeah, see if we can get Lucy's sound back together. So Bruce, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a few things that we do in terms of best practices. The first thing is that we try to make sure that all of our firewalls and all of our encryption software are as up to date and as robust as possible. I think that's very important. We're dealing in handling over $4 billion a year in aircraft transaction funds. And because of that, we want to make sure that our software is up to date. We also want to try to do our best in protecting wire transfer information. We really try to encourage folks in our aircraft transactions to use our secure channels in our closing room to upload and download wire transfer information. It's very critical because that's one of the sources where people tend to get hacked is through careless use of emails and transmitting that information. The third thing that we do is when we receive funds on a transaction, we use a 3-account process. We have an escrow account where the funds come in based on the wiring instructions. We also have a hidden account in the middle that not even our owner has access to, where the funds rest during the course of an aircraft transaction, which can be a couple of weeks, it can be several months that we're holding the deposit money for a transaction. Sometimes these deposits can be very sizable. And finally, as well as when we receive the purchase funds. And finally, when it's time for the funds to go back out, they come out of a third account. So we're protecting those monies as best that we can at all times. One thing that I'd like to comment on Merrick's comments about occupational fraud is that we carry a $40 million bond to address that. If in the event, unfortunately, it's never happened that we did have some sort of an employee issue. We're trying again to protect our customers' money.
Great, thank you. Steve Friedrich, any thoughts on the topic?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, and thanks, Merrick, for that background. I'd say one of the key things for us from a best practices standpoint was we start the know your customer process very early in the sales funnel. When we bring someone out of a lead, we start immediately looking at two things. One, their qualifications and their capability to purchase an aircraft. And then two, what would be our reputational risk for going through with a transaction? By the time that these people are prospects, we've already vetted them from that standpoint. So before we ever even get to a purchase agreement, we're very comfortable with who this client is, and more importantly, where the funds are coming from and where they're going to be using the aircraft. The other thing that we're constantly checking on as we participate in the global marketplace is there are various sanction lists and regulatory and legislative issues that we constantly look at and ensure that we're not inadvertently doing something inappropriate from a global perspective as well. So that's really part of the key process, is know your customer, know who you're transacting with, and understanding all the parties at the end who will be part of that purchase agreement.
Great, thank you, Steve. Joe Carfagna?
Well, really, there's kind of two levels that we have is we'll be retained by a buyer or seller, and in those agreements we have a provision in there that the person cannot be on any sort of restricted or blocked list, et cetera, et cetera. But where it's a little bit wider open is when we are selling an airplane to somebody and we're not familiar with who they are, and they come forward, and we do as much diligence as we can. And generally speaking, we have pretty good provisions in either our standard purchase agreement or the attorneys that we most routinely work with have good provisions in their agreements to protect the other side of the transaction. Meaning, you know, if we're representing the seller and a third-party buyer comes forward, that third-party buyer has to be vetted through the cannot be on the block list, cannot be restricted, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for the most part, the good attorneys in this industry have good language in purchase agreements that address it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Lucy, let's try you again to see if we've got your audio issue fixed. Nope, still can't hear you. No, okay. Merrick? Yeah, now we can hear you, Lucy. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. Trying different means here. So I don't know how much you caught earlier, but I think I'll piggyback a lot of what has already been said. And we ensure that our employees, our processes, and our systems are all well aligned and integrated at all levels to adequately detect and prevent fraud. And we don't take this lightly. We have many processes.
Lucy, can you speak up a little bit? We need a little more volume.
We have many processes in place in order to mitigate the risk as best as possible. And similar to what was already said, is we ensure that the process starts as soon as possible, as soon as we have a prospect identified, all the way through the life cycle of the transaction, including payoff. So, and we do some manual screening, but we also have automated screening that is in place for ongoing screening through the life of the transaction.
Okay, great. Merrick, could I call on you to give us a little bit of the background on the KYC, AML, BSA?
The ABCs of KYC, sure. So, they're all wrapped together. AML is not a specific law, but it is really, Jim, a grouping of a number of different regulations that have been in place going back 40 years now. KYC itself came out of the 2001 enactment of the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act in itself put teeth into the bank secrecy laws, or the Bank Secrecy Act, which was in place since 1970. When the Patriot Act came out in 2001, first of all, it applied strictly to financial institutions, and still really applies to financial institutions, but covers now a much broader array of transactions, and the definition of financial institution has been expanded. But what the 2001 Know Your Customer provisions of the Patriot Act did was really require those financial institutions to do two different things. One, customer identification, CIP, customer identification program, and customer due diligence, or CDD. I would say the CIP part, customer identification, all banks do the same way. It's very ministerial. It is literally, as it sounds, get to know your customer. For individuals, that can be satisfied with things like passports and licenses. For corporations, we're talking about certified articles of incorporation, partnership agreements, trust agreements, etc. The CDD part, which is actually run by FinCEN, is much more complicated. And really the aim there is to get banks and financial institutions to be able to predict customer behavior so that anomalies can be detected. And of course, there's certain enhanced due diligence that must be done depending on the size of the transaction, the complexity of the transaction. There's no real hard and fast rule, but certainly if you're not doing it right and you get caught either in a money laundering issue or the funding of terrorist organizations, which can inadvertently happen, there's some hefty fines that go along with that. But that's really the history of these laws and how they're all interplaying with one another.
Jim, you're on mute.
Yeah, my mistake. Merrick, I was going to ask you, do you see any additional laws or tightening up of the regulations coming up?
Well, it's always a possibility. And I would say, look, this is political to some extent. It depends who is in the White House next fall or this coming fall. I think if the current administration stays in place, we may actually see a loosening somewhat of these regulations, or at least the amount of regulation and oversight that is required of financial institutions. That's not to say that businesses will undo what they're currently doing. I think that they're in a pretty good place right now, and I think our customers tend to recognize that this is standard operating procedure now. If the Biden administration comes in, it is certainly possible that there would be even greater scrutiny and tightening of these regulations. What form that looks like, not exactly sure, but you know, it's the old adage that there's just a little bit more cost of doing business, it would seem like.
Great. Okay. Lucy, a question for you. When it comes to escrow, funding escrows and everything else, what's the best practices that you see at PNC?
Part of knowing the customer also includes the source of funds. So ensuring that we know the source of funds that are going into escrow. And in terms of the escrow company itself, I'm not sure if that's kind of what you're getting towards in the question, but working with escrow companies such as AIC Title that are bonded, have appropriate E&O coverage to protect those funds that not only the customer is sending in, but also that we as a bank are sending in on as part of the transaction.